And I am one of the horticultural supervisors here at Delights Nursery, Juniper Level Botanical Garden. And this morning we're going to take a quick stroll through one of the gardens here. We call this one the 49 garden because of the address with the house. And I'm going to point out a few plants that have edible properties or herb properties, as well as a few plants that are strongly advised that you not try them. And with that said, a couple of, I'm going to call them disclaimers. Oftentimes people ask, is a plant edible? Just bear in mind, all plants are edible once. Many of them. So with that said, I strongly encourage people, when you are buying plants or acquiring plants, or when people give you plants and say something is edible, please do your research. And not only research the identification of the plant, but also research the concentrations that you should eat or ingest, because some plants are fine, but you can cross thresholds of toxicity.
And some plants are deadly to pets.
Some plants are deadly to pets and edible to us. Things like onions, garlics, you do not want your dog or cat to eat those. And like you mentioned, there are a number of plants. And the same holds true. There are things that our pets and wildlife can eat that we should not. So just because one animal eats it or a person eats it doesn't mean that it's edible to you or to them. Case in point, birds, squirrels oftentimes eat berries and fruits and things that many of us know can be extremely toxic. And again, I strongly encourage, please, whenever you're buying a plant, that you consider an edible outside of a normal garden type plant that you are growing deliberately for fruits and vegetables. Please do your research, make sure identification is correct, and also make sure how you use or prepare the plant is right. So you've got your flowers, your fruit, your stems, your leaves, and your roots. So always make sure that not only is the plant identified correctly, but the part of the plant that you're going to eat and how to prepare it. So with that said, we'll get started and start taking a few looks at plants. And I'm going to point out different attributes and features that are the pros and cons for many of them. So if you happen to have any questions, or if you have a tidbit of information you'd like to interject, I strongly encourage that you share it.
What was your name again?
I'm Bill Reynolds.
Bill Reynolds. Nice to meet you.
And I appreciate you showing up this morning. Thank you. Going to start out with a couple common garden plants that many people will recognize. These are shade plants, and they're beautiful plants for their foliage. They have interesting flowers, especially the Asarums. Polygonatum. Polygonatums are Solomon sills. The roots are edible. However, remember and bear in mind, when you're eating the roots of a plant, what ultimately becomes of the plant? That is usually you're going to kill the plant because you are eating the roots, and the roots are an essential part of the plant for survival. So Polygonatum has edible roots. Things like Asarums, sometimes called wild gingers. Asarums are an interesting plant. When it comes to the ornamentals and what's available in the garden trade, there are native species that are found here in North America. There are also exotic species that come from Eurasia. And although they are very similar, the phytochemistries, that means the chemicals, the properties in them can vary a little bit. We'll walk on around this way. With regards to Asarums, they contain a number of compounds. One of the ones that I do, a couple of them I like to remind people, saffrol, which is like what you have in sassafras. It's a flavoring, kind of sassafras smell, sassafras flavor. There are concentrations of that are considered carcinogenic. And does anyone know what carcinogenic means?
Oh yeah.
Carcinogenic means cancer causing. And it's pretty important to mention that plants have been spending this whole time on Earth trying to develop mechanisms to prevent them from being eaten, and also to defend them from animals when they are eaten. So some of these chemical compounds taste really good, smell really good, but in the long term can be dangerous. Many of the Asarums have kind of a peppery taste, especially our native ones. They also contain, it's a difficult word to say, it's aristolochic acid. And aristolochic acid is a common derivative in what they call wild ginger that's put in dietary supplements. And it's a diuretic. That means it helps you to shed water, but it can, in high dosages and in improper dosages, cause kidney damage and kidney failure. So again, when you are eating or ingesting a garden plant, what we call edimentals, consider the fact some are about flavor, some are about medicinal use, and some are actually about eating. So always know your plant. Hostas. Hostas are wonderful plants, shade-loving, semi-sun. In the spring, from what I understand, the best and most edible part of the plant are the young shoots. And again, the Hosta, common plant in the ornamental trade, edible shoots. It is in the Asparagiaceae, so it's a relative of asparagus. So Hosta, beautiful plant, beautiful foliage, nice flowers, early spring, edible shoots. And do remember in the spring, when you're eating things like edible shoots off a plant, you may be affecting how much foliage and what kind of flowers and how much flowers you're going to get later on in the spring and summer. But again, Hosta. And you're going to see a lot of the Asarums, little heart-shaped leaves. We have a lot of varieties of Asarums in the garden. Many plants that are traditional fruit trees or garden orchard plants can also serve ornamental properties. Does anybody know what this is? This is a ginkgo tree. Ginkgos are either male or female. This is a female tree. And we've all heard of things like ginkgo biloba extracts that are used in different kinds of vitamins. The females are the only ones that produce the fleshy fruit. I'm going to use the word fruit in quotation marks because this is not a flowering plant, therefore the reproductive structure isn't a true fruit in the sense of a flowering plant. But the seeds are supposedly edible, and I like to use the word supposedly because, again, I haven't tried them. So we'll move on to the next plant. And I found that a lot of the woody trees and shrubs oftentimes produce fruits that are really nice. Does anybody know what this is? Persimmon. And of course, when we eat a persimmon, we want to eat a ripe persimmon because an unripened persimmon will pretty much turn your mouth inside out. It'll be very astringent.
There are two kinds. Which one would this be? This one that kind of looks like a tomato?
They all kind of do, but
yeah, this has got the large fruit.
Oh,
so this one I believe is the old world species, correct?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the native one has this.
the native one has a smaller fruit that to me is kind of reminiscent of a little pumpkin.
so when do they?
This is more of a late summer, early autumn.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're just starting to bloom now.
The persimmon only grow in tropical weather?
No, actually, all the plants that you see here in our garden are rated for kind of the zone 7, 8, and maybe a little warmer or a little cooler. So we have a pretty good widespread of plants, but they have all been garden tested. Every plant that you see, excuse me, the plants we have in our garden have spent the entire winter, multiple winters outside. We don't really offer them any additional or alternative heat sources. Occasionally we will protect plants early in the spring if they're starting to bloom, and again, this is just more for the aesthetics of the plant than it is their survival. But all the plants you see in our garden are rated to survive in this particular part of central North Carolina and related climate zones.
What about lemon trees or?
We're going to get to some interesting trees here in a minute. Very good question though. I'm going to point out a couple. Does anyone know what this is?
It's like an asparagus.
It is an asparagus. An asparagus is absolutely an edible. In fact, a lot of times asparagus is grown in our vegetable gardens for food purposes. You know, you eat the young shoots. But it also is a beautiful ornamental, very feathery leaves. And this is an excellent example of a plant that can serve multiple purposes, either in your vegetable garden as a vegetable that's edible or as an ornamental. Now you had mentioned citrus. Most citrus and citrus relatives are tropical to what we call macrothermal, meaning that they live in a zone where you can get occasional cold snaps, but not really extremely cold weather. And although we here are a southern climate, macrothermal, meaning that no month of the year, if you take the average temperature each month, our average temperatures are above freezing. That doesn't mean that our nighttime temperatures don't get low and our daytime temperatures can swing. And if you spend any time here in North Carolina, you know you can wake up to a 20-degree morning and you can finish your day with a 65-degree day. So you get a lot of temperature fluctuations. Most citrus are, as you know, pretty sensitive to freeze. But right here, we have a plant. This is called Poncirus triloba, oftentimes put in the genus Poncirus, although there's a lot of debates. Essentially, one of the things that separates this plant from the true citrus is it's a cold climate species and it's deciduous. Most plants in the genus Citrus are not deciduous. Now, the fruit on this, it's a little tiny orange. It has kind of a fuzzy peel. And you know what terpenes smell like? It's like the orange peel, lemon peel has that kind of bitter, citrusy, oily smell. These things have a really strong terpene to the rind, and they've got a lot of seeds, and they are extremely sour. Now see, I like sour. I love lemons and limes. Heads up on these, you know, you don't want to eat it like a lemon or a lime. I swear it'll take the enamel off your teeth in just one, one swipe. But it is something that's pretty good to use for flavoring. So if you're looking at making some sort of a citrus dressing for a salad, or say cooking fish, I don't mind using these right here to squeeze the really sour on meat or fish, or when I'm making certain dishes that call for the use of citrus. I like a lot of West Indian and Central American food.
Put it whole in a soup and then remove it?
I don't know about that. I've never tried that. I usually just strain the juice out, like with a typical citrus, or a screen strainer like a colander. But anyway, this is a citrus. Now, with that said, the Poncirus being very, very cold hardy, one of the steps that's been done is how can we make orange trees and grapefruits, things we typically think of as South Central Florida, how can we grow those in North Carolina? Show you something kind of cool. Talk about edible ornamentals. And this one makes me very happy. I need one of these in my yard. I'm originally from Florida, so I grew up on citrus. One we're headed for. This plant, this tree, right here, nice big tree, isn't it? My first year here, when I was, we were working over here in the 49, and I found a grapefruit. And I thought to myself, oh, somebody dropped a grape, and then I found another grapefruit. And I had a grapefruit in each hand, and I turned to the garden curator, and I'm like, where are the grapefruits coming from? And she pointed over. This tree right here, it is a hybrid. It is an interspecific cross between the Poncirus and the grapefruit. And interestingly, the grapefruit itself is a hybrid between the pomelo and the orange. But the fruit from this is very, very grapefruit-like. Maybe a slight tinge more sour. Remember, I told you Poncirus is very sour. But I find that the palatability and the edibility of the fruit that comes off this tree to be very akin to grapefruit. So whatever you would use for grapefruit, I like to use it for just the smell. You can use the rind, the peel for flavoring. You can candy it just like you would orange or grapefruit peel, lemon peel. So it can be candied. Really, really good. This again, really nice citrus plant.
Put the peel with chocolate.
You sure can. There's so many things you can do with it. And I'm just going to kind of point out again, like polygonatums, edible roots. Trilliums. Trilliums are beautiful plants. They come up in the early spring. I don't really advocate this because it's a plant that comes up with one leaf, one flower. That's what it does for its cycle. However, the leaves and the flowers on the trillium are edible. However, the taste is like lettuce. And given that you can get lettuce at the grocery store that tastes like lettuce, or you can grow something pretty like a trillium and take its leaf off and it tastes like lettuce, I tend to want to lean to just recommending lettuce. But it is edible.
Is that wild lettuce?
I don't believe so, no ma'am.
It kind of looks like wild.
It does, kind of, but
It's a primula.
it's a primula, yeah. Again, more hostas. I'm going to point out, maidenhair ferns, adiantums. I hear that they're edible, or there are components of this that are edible. I myself,
Some of the ferns, the
some of the fiddleheads. I strongly advise people when it comes to eating ferns. Ferns belong to a group of plants called pteridophytes. They're very ancient. I always tell people, I know that there are fiddleheads and there are edible ferns, and I know that maidenhair ferns make that list of edibles, but please, again, I strongly recommend before you eat garden plants and before you buy plants with the intention of eating, please do your research and make sure your identification is correct. That is very, very important.
There are some lookalikes.
There are some lookalikes.
The ginger.
The gingers. Flowers on gingers. Zingibers. Also, you know the ginger roots that you get in the store. And it's kind of fun because I like ginger roots to use for a lot of things. I really like using them in pear martinis. Am I allowed to say that on film? Anyway, I don't do it very often, but I bought some ginger roots at the grocery store, and I believe it's Zingiber officinale. Isn't that the commercial one? And that was back during Thanksgiving when I was visiting with my family, and I brought them home. put them on the counter in a bowl and didn't think about them. And one day I just noticed green shoots coming all up out of that bowl. So I decided to get a pot and pot them, and they're about so tall now, beautiful. Excellent example of an ornamental ornamental. And they also proliferate. You saw it spreads. This is an easy plant that you could scoop up, take the roots that you needed, or the parts, the flowers, I believe are also edible. And you can take bits and pieces of roots, replant the rest of it, and keep coming up. So this is a plant that, if you're using it at a reasonable rate, it's sustainable. And again, climate tested for zone 7B, 8A.
Having lived in Florida, you must be familiar with yucca.
Yuccas? I am.
Yeah. Can you grow that here?
We sure can. There are a lot of yuccas we can grow here.
Yes.
In fact, we'll pass and I'll point out a
see.
few. Some can be somewhat arborescent or tree-like.
That's, I'm used to seeing much smaller, not trees, like just like plants, but it's just a little bit small.
Got one here. We have here at Plant Delights Nursery at Juniper Level Botanical Garden, we have a large collection of yuccas and agaves that you will see planted throughout the gardens. Being that yuccas and agaves are mostly full sun loving, you're going to want to look on the peripheries of our gardens and on the what we call them kind of mountain or arid berms, where you'll see a lot of the cacti and things like that. And since we mentioned cacti, point this out real quick. Cactus. I have friends and family in in Arizona, New Mexico, and I always love the syrup made out of the prickly pear fruits, the Opuntia fruits. Now, there are many species of Opuntia. With that said, not all of them are edible in the sense of really being palatable, and some of them even can have chemistries that make them, well, they can disagree with you. So I'm not going to say, oh, you can eat any cactus. You also know that they have spines. What I do know with Opuntias that are edible, the most edible pads, can you see these new pads on the tops? You've got your old pads and you've got your really light green at the top. Those are typically your more edible parts of an Opuntia cactus. And my family and ancestors that did eat Opuntia, they would burn the spines off of them. So they would impale the pad, run it through a fire to burn the spines and the glaucids off of it. You really want to do that, because one of the most unsavory things is to prepare Opuntia, no matter how you do, and then they get spines in your tongue and gums. And if you've ever done that, it'll probably turn you off of eating Opuntia. But the fruits are very good. They're seedy. I find most of them to be pretty sweet. There are some that have, like I said, less palatable flavors and tastes. And while we're on the subject of plants in the garden that are edible, we spend a lot of time weeding and getting rid of weeds, correct? You know, we all do that, right? Find weeds. And I bet they've done a good job weeding over here, so now I'm not going to be able to find the weeds. Ah, there's one right there. Do you see the little yellow flower?
Yeah.
This little tiny yellow flower. It looks like clover leaves. The foliage looks like clover, the flower is yellow. That's an oxalis, and there are a lot of different species of oxalis. And oxalis, they contain oxalic acid, so that you don't want to ingest copious amounts of it. But I find that...
What you mean, the little one that's poking up.
Correct. That's actually
That one tiny little yellow
one
flower.
tiny little yellow
Oh, yeah.
flower, and then the leaves look like clovers.
Right.
It's actually not related to clover. It's its own. It's a different family of plants.
And you're saying they're...
It's edible. The flowers, the fruit, and the foliage are edible. They have kind of a sour taste.
Yeah.
In fact, when I was a kid, we used to eat the little seed pods. It looks like little tiny okras. It tastes kind of like dill pickles.
Okay.
But it's we sell oxalis, or at least we have in the past, oxalis plants. They're different ornamentals, and I have quite a few of them from here that I grow in pots. And I have no qualms whatsoever just taking a few leaves and flowers every once in a while and kind of squishing them up and putting them in my salad, because it adds kind of a sour, tart element to salads. Excuse me. A little bit like lime. It has, and like I said, sometimes kind of almost a dill pickle taste, and that I imagine people are going to notice different flavors, but to me, over here, here's a weed. This is a very common weed in the spring. This is chickweed.
Yeah.
Chickweed is edible.
It kills your appetite.
It does. can,
Okay.
but it's an edible plant. So a lot of times the plants that we spend time getting out of our ornamentals are themselves edible. So kind of herby edibles. And for me,
Chickweed pesto.
yep, chickweed pesto.
You don't want your guests to eat too much.
We don't. All right, that is the secret. Well, I'm going to wind this up, but before I do, let's take a quick walk to the crevice garden, and I'm going to point out a couple more plants. I know you had mentioned one earlier, the kale, the sea kale. And a lot of times when we raise edimentals or flavoring type plants in our gardens, we can also do that for our pets, and I'm going to point out one. Now we are going to navigate around the agave here. It has been declawed on the tips, but not entirely. There you go. Let's walk out on the road. You're welcome to do that. Now, there are a lot of plants that we grow in our gardens that are in the mint family. And that can include things like rosemary, oregano. There are a bunch of them, mints. And we use those oftentimes more so for flavorings than ingestion. But I do like to remind people that the thymol in thyme or in oregano, the menthol in mints, these are really meant to be small dosage, even in their essential oils, because not unlike a lot of other chemicals in plants, they are potentially carcinogenic. And this has to do with the nature of the molecule. They're called aromatics, and we've all heard of things like benzene, right? Well, these aromatics are actually built off a benzene base, and that's how the plant makes these really complex aromatic, flavorful compounds. So thymol, I believe pelagiol. Not really very good at saying that word.
So you can add a little bit of thyme to the kale, but you wouldn't make a pot full.
Correct. And the same with oregano, things like that. These are the reasons we call them spices, and we use spices for flavoring. And a lot of people really like to flavor up their food. And I always tell people, when you're dealing with spices, be very careful. Because as we know, even things like salt can be excessive. So, and that's not necessarily plants, but I'm just telling, be careful with your flavoring.
Water. I passed a couple of kidney stones and drank too much water.
No, got to be careful.
And I was in too much pain to remember to put sea salt in it. Big mistake.
Does anybody know what this is?
Looks like
Kind of does. It's in that same family. It's in that mint family. Remember I said some of the edimentals we can also raise for our
But
pets.
there are so many oreganos.
There are. Do you like cats?
That's not catnip.
We're
That's,
cat people here.
Kitty crack.
Kitty crack. Catnip.
that's
Yeah, a little bit of this right here make you kitty crazy. Now, a lot of people, the cats are already crazy even before the catnip. A friend of mine has a cat named Lola. She's crazy all the time. Catnip just brings it out. But anyway, we can grow things like this that are ornamentals that we can also grow for our pets. And things like the sea kale. Here we go. Wonderful ornamental sea kale. It's kale. It's in the cabbage family. Brassicaceae. It is a kale. Very edible. Also a very pretty plant. And as is the case with many plants in this family, the mustard family, when they grow, they make the little yellow flowers, the cruciferous. They're little four-petaled flowers, kind of like a little cross. The flowers are also edible, and many of them have kind of a mustard flavor. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, mustard comes from the flowers of the mustard plant, which is in the same family, Brassicaceae.
They all, my understanding is that going back, they all come from the mustard.
I believe they do.
Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, it all comes
They're all the
from
same species, correct.
Yeah.
They're just different cultivars. It's the same thing with like yellow crookneck squash and zucchini squash, same species.
Yeah.
And then, many of the plants we grow in our gardens to eat can also be grown as ornamental. So just bear in mind, if the plant's pretty and you think you got a spot to grow it, do it. And it's really nice to mix plants with their textures, their colors, their smells, their flowers, their foliage, and the occasional ability to go out and just kind of graze. Go pick a little something fresh to add to your dinner. And with that said, I'm going to kind of wind it up, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.